Hi, my name is Mitchell Furman, and I'm the energy and economy reporter for the Texas Tribune. Thank you for tuning in for this conversation on building a strong economy as part of the Texas Tribune's Symposium on the Future of Rural Texas. I'm joined today by Lindsay Bowers, Katie Linger, and Senator Lois Kolkhorst. Lindsay Bowers is a farmer in Jackson and Victoria counties and is a grain merchandiser for United Ag, a large co-op based in El Campo that serves communities along Texas's Gulf Coast. Katie Linger serves as the executive director of the Borger Economic Development Corporation, where she works alongside business owners and corporations to identify opportunities for profitable ventures in Borger, Texas, in Hutchinson County in the Panhandle. And Senator Kolkhorst has represented Senate District 18 since 2015. She serves as chair of the Health and Human Services Committee and sits on the Finance, Nominations, Transportation, and Water and Rural Affairs Committee. Thank you all for joining. Let's get started. Ms. Linger, the coronavirus has impacted the state's economy dramatically. How are you faring in Borger and more broadly the Panhandle?
Well, thank you, Mitchell. I think that Texas has really shown out a little bit here in an unexpected way during COVID. We've all certainly been impacted, but we fared better than I think we thought we would in a few ways. One is that COVID really forced us to get on the same page as the rest of the state when it comes to technology. There's certainly still room for some improvements there, but we kind of saw overnight our schools and workplaces implement the kind of technology that was readily available in other areas, and we were able to do it really quickly. Economically speaking, people staying at home and being in their local communities, locked down, if you will, actually for the local economy had a pretty positive effect. We saw in a lot of rural areas sales tax collections go up and small businesses fare much better than we thought they might given the shutdown. And so we're cautiously optimistic that we've actually made a little bit of progress during this unusual time.
And Ms. Bowers, over in your part of the state, the unemployment rate in Victoria in September was nearly 9%. How has business been for you?
So, my husband and I, we farm, and then I'm a grain merchandiser at United Ag, like was mentioned. And from an ag standpoint, we're resilient, and we've proven that we definitely are essential. So business has went about as normal for the most part. We've been able to sustain our employees. I'm thankful for um, the funds that came available in order to help with the layoffs and things like that. That was tremendous for a lot of small business in rural America. But we're continuing to tick along. I think that day-to-day operations for the most part weren't affected because we had to continue to do what we do, and that's feed, fuel, and clothe America.
Yeah, and Senator Kolkhorst, along these lines with the coronavirus, how have you at the state level been able to help people and businesses impacted by the coronavirus in your district?
Well, first, let me say thank you for having me today. And Katie and Lindsay, great to see you. Wonderful. I know United Ag right there in El Campo, fabulous business. Love working with them. So, to answer that question, when it all hit in March, I set up a series of phone calls with my state representatives. So, I had state representatives joining calls. We were on phones with county judges, with our hospitals, with our mayors. We were on the phones with our chambers of commerce and really working to try to figure out what was happening, what was the next step. And so the CARES Act has been mentioned with the PPP assistance to our businesses was huge. The CARES Act, when you look at what we received in our cities and counties, not so much because mid-size and small cities and counties didn't receive their money directly like the 18 jurisdictions that did. And I'll just be honest, it sticks in my craw. So Each constituent in our more urban centers are worth $175 per person versus $55 in the rural areas. And by the way, in our state, you had to apply for it, only get 20% up front. Then you had to qualify for it. And they created categories in which you could qualify. So we weren't able to, many of our communities weren't able to access the CARES Act funding for our small business assistance like you did in the urban centers. But I'd like to add something here. So you mentioned in the Victoria area that unemployment had gotten up to 9%, but it never got to what we saw in our large metropolitan areas like 13 and 14%. And in fact, I will say, look at the unemployment data today. Most of the rural areas that I represent are down in the 6% and below at this point. The only exception of that is Aransas County. They're hovering around 9% because they're so reliant on tourism. So it's really been interesting. And I love to hear what Katie and Lindsay said about the optimism of rural Texas. We are resilient, and we didn't receive the money that we saw going to the urban centers in the CARES Act with our cities and our counties. And yet we bowed our neck and we got it done. So many of the communities I represent went out and just raised their own money, got donations to then help other small businesses. They took their own taxpayer money, maybe in a utility fund, and helped their own businesses. And I just think that's a character of what we are in rural Texas. We roll our sleeves up. We don't let anything deter us. And that is something I know you're going to get into about our schools as well. Most of our schools are back face to face, and the Texas Tribune did a very good but alarming article on how many children are failing that are doing distance learning. And so I just want to thank Lindsay and Katie for the optimism you've shown and what you're doing out there and how we're recovering.
And Ms. Slinger, the senator just got into some of the investments that maybe take place in the larger cities and counties in the state that maybe don't happen as much in rural Texas. And we have a question. We got a bunch of audience questions from folks who wrote in, and this one from Ken kind of goes along those lines. What is the best way to incentivize investment in rural Texas so the metro hubs do not draw all of the development?
Well, I think whenever we're looking at incentivizing development in our communities, we have to be really conscious about what makes our communities different and consider what's most important and what's highest on the priority list, not just for the local leaders, but for the citizens. So I know here in Borger, we've put a major emphasis on updating our comprehensive plan in the last few years and taking a lot of citizen input during that process so that we can really understand what the existing residents' desires are and what they believe would make us a more competitive and more appealing community. And then taking our city and economic development corporation strategic plans and seeing where we align with citizens' desires and picking those highest ranking 2 or 3 things and really playing them out. I think one thing that we are good at in rural areas is getting a strong identity for our towns. If you'll travel to these small rural towns and you'll hear some declare themselves like the cheeseburger capital of Texas, or they have these kind of, and you might laugh, but in a way we get these really strong identities and people are very proud of their roots in these rural areas. So being able to solidify that identity, focus on just a couple of core things and really play those through. I think that's when we're talking about incentives, we should really be focusing on developing and building on that identity, getting some successes under our belt, and then using those as building blocks to progress. I'll give you an example. So here in Borger, the town was founded about 100 years ago. We kind of boomed overnight. It was, oil was found here. And so the town went up really, really fast, grew rapidly. And then as that activity slowed down a little bit, the town has shrunk. So we were left with a lot of vacant buildings. And from listening to our citizens and evaluating our own strategic, planning efforts and looking at from a fiscal standpoint, what's a responsible way to use our money in incentives, we've decided that adaptive reuse of existing buildings is very high on our priority list. That if we don't do anything about redeveloping some of these vacant properties, they eventually become the city's problem and have to use taxpayer money to tear them down and abate asbestos. So we're putting an emphasis whenever businesses are looking at coming into the community or existing businesses want to expand, we are really emphasizing using existing buildings, and we are willing to incentivize them at a higher rate because we want to avoid down the line them becoming the city's problem. So we've joined the PACE program through the PACE program throughout the state of Texas, so that we can get some creative financing for those projects. So it's not all on the economic development or local government to provide money for those projects. But the citizens have told us that that's an issue. We've identified it's an issue. We've identified a way to take those projects on that's fiscally responsible and sustainable. And it's not always possible to use an existing structure instead of building new. But that's specific for Borger. And I think rural communities need the flexibility and freedom to kind of make some of those decisions on a local level. I know we're big advocates of local control, and there can be a lot of frustration, at the state level and these urban centers setting policy for rural areas. We like autonomy, and we would like to make those decisions for ourselves. And we think we're pretty good at it, at identifying what we need and partnering with businesses to make those projects profitable for everybody.
That's interesting. And Senator, I know the issue of funding getting dispersed beyond the urban centers comes up a bunch in Austin. With the pandemic, impacting the economy, and Comptroller Hager, he's forecasted a fairly gloomy budget. How do you help support these kinds of investments that Ms. Linger's talking about for rural Texas?
Well, I think we have our challenges, certainly. Economic development happens on a local level. Now, we do have the Enterprise Fund, and we're always just thrilled when we can get some of those monies to go to rural Texas on some of our bigger projects. But I do think that, what we're going to see post-COVID is that it could actually be a benefit to rural Texas. One of the things that I don't know if y'all have seen these stats, but there is a migration going on across our nation. But I was looking at an article, the top 6 areas cities that are suburban areas that are receiving more people fleeing the urban centers are in Texas, 6 out of 10. And so I think that when we go back to session, we really have an opportunity to look at what the migration patterns are. And I will tell you that one of the things I believe that Katie brought it up was, what we learned, right overnight was how important broadband was, high-speed internet, great connectivity. We're one of only 6 states in the United States that does not have a statewide plan. I've joined 87 other state reps and senators in saying that we need to do this, and we need to do it and deploy broadband. And when I say that, something that is of high speed so that people can do business in our big businesses and people, you can work and do business in rural areas. And so that's going to be, I think, our biggest opportunity in the next session. And it's going to take an investment.
Yeah. And Ms. Bowers, we have another audience question, and this one's about producer associations. And please, any of you chime in as well. This question's from Darby, who asks, what can producer associations do to better serve rural communities?
So producer associations, I'm assuming you're talking about like Texas Corn Producers, NCGA, some of those associations. The great thing about those is that they're grassroots to begin with. And actually, Jeff Nunley with South Texas Cotton and Grain said just last week, he said, for the most part, we're going to help ourselves. What can you do for farmers? Well, farmers are going to help themselves. And that goes to a testament of that resilience that you see in agriculture, that you see in the rural area. So they're going to continue. We need to continue to elevate our voice through those associations and to be active in them, to carry our message, that the fact that we do believe that agriculture is the heartbeat rural areas, that right now, I mean, it's the second largest industry in Texas, second, I think, only to oil and gas. That's significant. Direct impacts, economic impacts, we provide over 2 million jobs. And if you look out to Supplier and Induced, you're talking about 4 million jobs. So we need to carry that message louder through those associations that we are a huge footprint in Texas and that we matter. Right now, I think that, when I think about the urban-rural divide, I think that the most concerning thing to me is that the average age of a farmer is 58. That's scary. And it's scary because that means that we're having a really hard time getting farmers, getting our children, our own children. I'm raising 3 boys in addition to cotton, corn, Milo, catfish, and cattle. I'm going to have a hard time getting them to come back to the farm. And that's scary. And it's not just because of the lack of broadband and the concerns about healthcare. It's also about the concerns of stability in agriculture. Being able to know that we have a predictable environment, especially when we face so many things that are constantly unpredictable, like the weather, like hurricanes, things like that. So I think that those associations need to continue to help us elevate our voices to where we can reach out to the urban areas, to where they understand what we're actually doing and that we're making an impact beyond even just providing food, clothes, and fuel to everyone, but also just the economic impact that we have.
And is it the producer associations can help kind of incentivize young people like your kids to potentially join the industry?
I think that that's our own responsibility, to be honest with you. I mean, if you're talking about just like it being a staffer point of view, I think that it's our responsibility in agriculture. It's our responsibility in our rural economies to decide to have some accountability to do the things that Katie's doing in her community, to make sure that we're communicating with our representatives like Senator Kolkhorst, to where we're creating an environment that they want to come back to and that they can afford to come back to.
And Ms. Slinger, we just had a presidential election, and as we speak, they're still counting the votes, but it appears at this moment that Joe Biden is going to be the next president. If he does indeed win, what does that mean for the Panhandle and for kind of rural economies?
Well, we won't know yet. Frankly, I don't know that rural areas really feel like they have a good handle on what that agenda is going to look like. But what I do know is that if you look at in rural Texas specifically, I can't speak for the entire nation, but I imagine many other rural areas would agree with me when I say, not to beat a dead horse, but we are so steady and resilient. A lot of the industry or, the economic base in our region, as the other guests here have mentioned today, as Lindsay and the senator have mentioned, are so essential. We're talking agriculture, we're talking farming and ranching, food production. In our community, it's a very heavy industrial community. We have a refinery and large petrochemical complex here. For better or worse, as a lot of towns have maybe been larger in the 50s and 60s and seen their population decline over time as people have moved to urban areas, what's left in that rural town is absolutely essential, solid business. Kind of the frills are all gone. Okay, we're talking about extremely solid industry. the great thing about that is we've just, already talked about today is our unemployment rate did not have the crazy spikes that some of these more urban areas did, because everybody here is essential practically. I mean, we certainly did see a little bit of effect. Nobody was unscathed. But I think we're pretty good at still chugging along, kind of no matter who's in office. But that's not to underplay the importance of, especially for small businesses. I think that there can be some bipartisan agreement to make sure that really large industries, big pharma, big tech, even really large oil and gas companies are held to a reasonable amount of accountability, but those same regulations cannot be passed down to very small businesses. It kills them. And so I think that for the most part, that's understood. I think one thing that the election has shown us is has been much narrower than anybody thought it would, which means that there are a lot more people in the middle than really, I think, either party probably realized. And that means that whoever's in office is going to have to appeal to that, down the middle constituent, that those communities in the middle of the country who really kind of make or break these elections every 4 years, and that it can't be a radical agenda in either way. We've got to look at education, at the infrastructure that senators mentioned as far as broadband and accessibility for everyone. I think infrastructure has a lot to gain no matter really who wins the presidency. That seems to be an area of spending that both parties at least say that they agree on some level. I think that rural Texas could really benefit from the expansion or really seeing through this Ports to Plains development, the highway that would connect, Mexico to Canada. Just looking at how it does not work to be reliant on countries overseas for the supplies of our goods. We need to improve our ability to move goods throughout the United States of America and connect with, Canada and Mexico, and be able to bring goods in from other places and transport them efficiently. That Ports to Plains corridor could be huge for rural Texas. Right now, everything, kind of west of 35 is everything west of 35. It kind of all gets clumped together, but by putting the Ports to Plains corridor throughout the West Texas region and up through the country, I think that would open up a lot of opportunities for development. There's tons of land, out here. The cost of living is very inexpensive, but we do suffer at times from being isolated. And having some investment in infrastructure, I think that could end up on the agenda of either president. So that could be good for a rural area. But overall, I think we're resilient. We're going to keep chugging along with our very basic, very essential industry, no matter who is in office.
Can I add something to that, though? If Biden goes on to be the victor, the concern, I think, for rural Texas and for Texas in general, because Katie mentioned, petrochemical, the oil and gas, the Green New Deal will be devastating to the state of Texas. And so, we've been an oil and gas state. Lindsay mentioned it's the number one economic driver, number two, being agriculture. So those two are tied to rural Texas in a huge way. So obviously it would be devastating, not only to Texas, but to America if Joe Biden delivers on a campaign promise with that.
I'm glad you said that, Senator, and I completely agree. That's, why I mentioned that middle of the road. We can't have those radical agendas. I'm hopeful with there being a balance between the president and hopefully the Senate, that those more radical agendas won't play out for rural Texas, frankly, because the senator is absolutely correct in that it's just not feasible, really, at this point in time. Frankly, I don't believe that they'll be able to deliver on that promise. Our country is in no way prepared to shift away completely from fossil fuel. We just don't even have the ability, the infrastructure to do that without.
No country does.
No country does. The world doesn't have that ability.
It would weaken us on the world stage in a huge way.
Good point, Senator.
And Ms. Bowers, just to to close up, do you agree that, the president and whoever's in office isn't necessarily as determinative for rural Texas, and y'all will keep kind of chugging along? Or is it maybe...
I honestly didn't get nervous about this until I saw that I was going to be asked about this. I'm pretty obviously opinionated about it. I do think that it's going to shape our future in urban and rural areas. I think and honestly, more than anything, it's going to shape the future of my children's future, and it is concerning. So,
I will say that go look at rural Texas. That's Trump country. It is soundly red. Texas, when you look at Texas or the United States in general, and this is really telling on these maps now that we're drilling into where the votes are coming from, you only see a few blue dots across the entire nation. So I can speak very profoundly for rural Texas, since I represent a goodly portion of it, is that it's solidly conservative, both on their values and their approach to business and taxation and
regulations. I mean, that's as far as like being in agriculture, those are the things that scare me the most when I look at Biden's agenda, as far as what the expectations coming down from regulations and such. I mean, we made a lot of headway in the last 4 years with like the waters, things like that. Yeah. And it's scary what could be changed that we worked so hard for.
WOTUS will devastate agriculture, and that was proposed under Obama. It was repealed under Trump. I would suspect if Biden is the president, it will come roaring back.
I would love to. I have way more questions, and I know we have an upcoming legislative session that a lot of folks are interested in, but unfortunately we are out of time. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you, Lindsay Bowers, Katie Linger, and Senator Lois Kolkhorst for joining us. For more coverage from the Texas Tribune, visit texastribune.org. and help us keep the conversation going by becoming a Texas Tribune member at texastribune.org/give.
Thank you.
Thanks.